Welcome everybody, ITM staff, students, alumni, and guests from outside ITM to our second session of the EcoHealth seminar series. The seminar series is organized by the EcoHealth group, which is an interdepartmental group at ITM, bringing together researchers from different backgrounds and disciplines. And what we all have in common is that we recognize the need to move towards a more comprehensive and systemic approaches to understanding and improving health, especially in the context of complex health challenges emerging at the interface between humans, animals, and their broader natural and social environments. A clear case of such a challenge is, of course, the current COVID-19 pandemic, but there are many others. For this seminar series, we invited speakers that will introduce and discuss ecosystem concepts and approaches to health in relation to the global challenges that we are facing today, such as climate change and emerging infectious diseases, but also other crises, such as the global rise of NCDs, urbanization, among other things. So they will illustrate how and why systems thinking should or can be applied to better understand such issues and to analyze our causal interactions and inform solutions. In the coming months, we will start with a number of more general conceptual seminars introducing the why, and this is followed by more in-depth seminars in 2021, focusing on the how of EcoHealth. Today, we are lucky to have Professor David Waltner-Toews with us, who will give us his perspectives and insights on EcoHealth concepts. Waltner-Toews is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Guelph and is founding president of the Network for Ecosystem Sustainability and Health. He has done foundational EcoHealth research and theoretical work on integrating human, animal, and ecosystem health and successfully bridges natural sciences, humanities, and social sciences in his efforts. Professor David Waltner-Toews will present a seminar on EcoHealth in an era of rapid change, in which he addresses the old and deep-seated arguments in health and ecology that arises from a tension between, on the one hand, our understanding of systems as having a local integrity with borders to keep out invasive species and to conserve and save the species inside them. And on the other hand, our understanding of ecosystems as being complex constructs with porous borders accommodating migratory species that can change, enrich, and or destroy our understanding of local integrity. He will then further explore how these different conceptions have implications not only for biodiversity and conservation, but also for immigration and the nation state. We hope that this seminar will inspire you, and after the presentation, which will take about 30 minutes, we will have another 30 minutes for a Q&A session, for which Professor David Waltner-Toews will join us as well. So please do not hesitate to send your questions through a chat function, and the session will be moderated by Chiara. David, I give the floor to you.
This picture actually from Canadian artist Robert Gonsalves, who died a few years ago, to me typifies somewhat the kind of era we're in, where we come out of some sense of security and then walking, it's called stepping stones, but we're not quite sure where those stepping stones are going, and it looks a little dangerous, which I think it probably is, and that may or may not be a good thing. Let's see, how can I make this go there? I don't seem to be able to go backwards, but I will go ahead. Many of us are, I'm assuming that many of us have some background in systemic approaches or thinking about systemic connections. And if we look specifically at this pandemic in this context we're in, some of the most frustrating things have to do with the fact it's caused by a zoonotic agent. So it came from animals and it moves to people. And the general consensus over the last century or so is those diseases cannot, maybe with a few exceptions, but they cannot be eradicated. And so that's one of the challenges. It's also shattered our fantasies of complete control of nature. And I've been challenged by others to say, well, we don't have those fantasies anymore, but I beg to differ. Certainly coming out of looking at foodborne diseases and so on, there are still a lot of people who believe we have at least more control than we thought we did. And the third thing here is that it's lasting long enough to destroy really what in some measures has been seen as the most successful global economy in the world's history in terms of generating global finances, if you wish. A lot of the focus of the discussions around this pandemic have been about the virus. And that's partly because that's where our traditional science is best at looking at things, structures, viruses, antibodies, animals, and so on. But when we're looking at a zoonotic disease, we're also looking at reservoirs, which is where these agents live without causing too much trouble, and then they spill over from that into people, and hosts, who are ourselves. We should, if the English language were logical, one would say that the pathogens should be guests, and if we're hosts, but we generally don't, at least deliberately, invite them into our homes. If we look at conventionally how we've looked at these zoonotic diseases, or more generally diseases that come from animals, we have tended to associate them with specific animals. So from livestock, we've looked at BSE, mad cow disease, E. coli, Rift Valley fever in East Africa. And then from wildlife, we have Lyme disease, Ebola, SARS. And then in the middle, from both sides, from both livestock and wildlife, we have rabies and tuberculosis, West Nile virus, and a whole range of diseases. Bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, those kinds of things. So we've tended to classify things according to the animals from which we get them. And in Europe, for instance, if it's Q fever, people tend to say, well, it's goats. Or if it's salmonella, it's probably, well, that's less clear. And that's one of the things that I think we need to think about. As I was working on this, the last 10, 15 years working on these issues, I was looking first at the conventional classification. So how do the agents get from these animals to us? Well, they come directly. So either we bite them, which is really what we're doing when we eat food. So we're directly ingesting salmonella or E. coli, or they bite us. And the classic case there is, of course, rabies. Another possibility is that they get transmitted from other animals to us through arthropods of various sorts. So West Nile virus in mosquitoes, that comes from birds. Lyme disease, arachnids, tiny ticks, but that also involves deer, and you have this cycle. And we begin to shift into a situation where it's not just a particular animal, it's several animals, and it's the environment in which these animals are living. And it's in this context where much of the early EcoHealth work was developed, and it's very important, and it raises some issues in the current situation, and I'll come to those later. The other is in the shared environment, and what I've shown here are three different shared environments. One of them is on the top right, is when we have animal visitation programs, for instance, in hospitals, and one might ask some questions about a dog in an ICU unit and what might be going on there. In the upper left is a situation where I was looking at Hydata disease in Kathmandu, and you have dogs and you have animals being slaughtered in that environment. And we have the cycling of a parasite, which normally would be in dogs where it causes no problem. It gets into usually ruminants where it creates these cysts, and the butchers throw the cysts out and the dogs eat them and they get reinfected. In most parts of the world, this has been associated with shepherds and sheep herders in New Zealand and Spain and Chile and the United States. You get this kind of recycling. There are other kinds of this parasite which occur with wildlife, for instance, foxes and wolves or coyotes and deer. But you have this kind of a shared environment. And then we have the home environment where we have children and dogs, and the children, of course, get into the dog and cat food and share the microbiomes, if you wish. In order for something to become pandemic, it not only has to come from the animals to us through whatever mechanism, but it has to adjust to humans in a way that we transmit it person to person. And for the most part, those pandemics have been viral. Now, historically, there have been some like bubonic plague, which is transmitted by fleas, and it's an microbe, it's a bacteria, Yersinia pestis, and that appeared to spread person to person, but in fact, it was because of contamination with fleas. And although there was some person to person, it wasn't that well adapted to that situation. Viruses, because they are less stable, they have structures that they pick up genetic material from different places, and they might come from waterfowl, which is where avian influenza, all influenzas really, their reservoir, their reservoir, their original reservoirs in water birds, ducks and geese. And it doesn't cause problems there. It's an enteric virus. And then if it gets into an intermediate species like pigs, then there's some reassortment of the virus that adapts to that. And then we get it and we get influenza. And if we look at avian influenza, in fact, it never went through that intermediate stage, and it has remained a strict zoonosis. It never became pandemic. In order to get it, you have to have direct exposure. So again, it's easier to think of it in more conventional ecosystem health kinds of terms because it's more localized. If you are exposed to chickens that have this, then you get this disease. It's less likely that it becomes pandemic because it's not, hasn't adapted to being transmitted person to person. If I've lived long enough to have gone through many of these iterations of how we look at integrated approaches to human health and the health of other animals, the health of the environments we share. In some of the early days, there was something called ecosystem health. The idea was you could draw boundaries around something and you could assess the health of it the way we would assess the health of an animal or a person or perhaps a farm or even a community. We could say this is a healthy agroecosystem or community, and this is an unhealthy one. When it became problematic because there were these boundaries were so porous and it was difficult to assess an ecosystem in isolation from others, we began to shift to some of the other ones. The parallel one to ecosystem health was called ecosystem integrity, and that one came more out of environmental science backgrounds. The International Joint Commission of the Great Lakes between Canada and the United States talked about the integrity of the Great Lakes. At the other end of this spectrum, if you want, there's the idea that ecosystems or landscapes and communities are wide open and they're always changing. Historically, they've changed at various rates. And the whole notion of a healthy ecosystem is problematic because the boundaries you can't define them very well. And I once raised this issue with a colleague of mine who's a theologian, and he said, actually, that's the same argument that occurred in Europe in the 1930s. The Nazis and fascists were talking about essentially ecosystem integrity and ecosystem health. So we draw boundaries around this. If everybody stays there, if the system is stable, then we have ecosystem integrity. As soon as you have immigrants coming in, invasive species, then it destroys that integrity. And at the other end, we had the, if I want to call it the American view, where everything is changing and it's kind of like jazz and you improvise as you go along. And what we tried to do is find a way to a middle ground, if you want, where you try to preserve things, but you don't say everything has to go back to the way it was before people were here, because that's clearly not going to happen. But it's not, doesn't change rapidly all the time. How do we find that sort of a balance? And some of these other ones, sustainable livelihoods, focused on the human activities within these ecosystems. And the other was the most recent, if you want, catchword has been One Health, one medicine, one health, the idea that everything is related. Some of these are more bureaucratically attractive, like One Health, so the World Health Organization and Centers for Disease Control, the veterinarians, the Office International Epizootique in Paris, they've adopted this One Health. It's a way to talk about these things without necessarily delving down into what does this mean in practice, other than that we collaborate, which is all important. So just to summarize this a little bit, these systemic approaches, ecosystem approaches to health, EcoHealth, they often default to fixed boundaries. So the health of an animal, the health of a farm, the health of a person, the health of a community. In an era when things are very rapidly changing, these fixed boundaries are problematic, and they've become more problematic in the last 20 years, let's say, than they were in the post-war period. Another way to look at this is to say, instead of viewing the system as something fixed that we can say, okay, this is a healthy system, we can look at the story of this, the narrative. And it's not that one is wrong and one is right, although I've seen arguments, at least in academia, that if you have narratives, then you can't talk about systems. I don't think that's true. I think you can talk about how systems unfold over time. And then we need to think about who is telling the story. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. And I want to focus now a bit more on this particular the pandemic that we're in, because it illustrates a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. So the story of this interaction of people with this virus goes beyond what, there was a Russian ecologist, Pavlovsky, who wrote a book called The Natural Nidality of Transmissible Diseases. And a lot of his work was on bubonic plague on the Mongolian steppes, and there was a natural nest cycle there. There were marmots and fleas, and the cycle was there. And that nest, if you want, is still there. But we're in a situation now where these nests, if you want, are all over the world and they're connected to each other. So yes, there are particular places, or niduses is what Pavlovsky would have called them, where we would find plague or Lyme disease or some other diseases, but the boundaries are not nearly as clear as they might have been when he was doing his studies 100 years ago. If we try to look now at the broader narrative here, one of the suggestions has been that the virus has come from bats, and there's good evidence for this. Bats are 20-25% of all mammalian species, so there are a lot of opportunities there for them to be harboring agents that might be transmissible to us. Also, the virus is, in the current virus, the SARS-CoV-2, is 96% similar to viruses that they have already found in bats. The issue there is that, I mean, we're 96% similar genetically to chimpanzees, and we're not the same, right? So there's variation in there. So then the question is how it must have come through some circuitous route, and the virus changes over time. How then did it get from this reservoir and change this 4%, if you want, and to get into people? It might have come from bats directly, and I will look at one situation where that is probably the case. Not this virus, but another virus. In this case, it may have come via other animals, and there have been suggestions that came through pangolins, which is one of the most widely traded wildlife animals in the world, primarily for perceived medicinal values of its external plates, and it's this animal here. It's natural medicine if you want, but these are basically keratin plates. It's like fingernails and hair, but it's been marketed a certain way. In early suggestions where it came through snakes, raccoon dogs, which are bred for their fur. They're farmed, but they're also hunted in the wild in areas of North China where they're not found naturally. So it might have gone through a farm, if you wish, and then people have been exposed that way. And cane rats, which are both a pest, an agricultural pest, but in some cases they've been seen as delicacies, so people will eat them. So there's some possibilities here. We can look at other bat to human transmissions of pathogens, not particularly this one, but some other ones. One of them is Ebola virus, which we're fairly certain is harbored by fruit bats in parts of Africa. If we look at where the disease has emerged, there was a political violence in Liberia and République de Guinée in the 1990s and early 2000s, civil war and a lot of fighting, displacement of people. This was followed by billions of dollars of investments in mining over the next decade, and more than half of Liberia's forests were sold off to industrial loggers. So we have people who were massively displaced already by war and trying to establish new places to live. And then we have these mining companies coming in and the forestry companies. So people are pushed to the margins. They're looking for new food, including eating bats. And you can see there's a basket of bats here. But also they're looking for what we call bushmeat. So these are wild animals that may have been exposed to the virus from bats and they're already sick, so they're easier to catch. So it might be a monkey or it might be a duiker, a small antelope. And these animals then are carrying the virus. So it might have come directly from bats or it might have gone through some of these other species. And then we had between 2014 and 2016, about 29,000 people sick with Ebola and 11,000 dead. So a massive outbreak, massive epidemic. And 2018, there was another outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo, which is further east from here, east and south. 2,300 dead within a couple of years. And the initial outbreak here was near Virunga Park, which is a guerrilla sanctuary, and there was rebel fighting, and the government was talking about introducing oil exploration into this wildlife park. So again, we have this dynamic of, if you want, industrial development, displacement of people, encroachment into wildlife areas, and people looking for new sources of food, and then we have this transmission. Another example, which is perhaps more germane to what we're looking at now. In the late 1990s, the city of Singapore, in order to keep the city clean, they offloaded much of their agricultural production, and they eat a lot of pork, and they have a lot of pork in their diet. So pigs were being raised not on the island of Singapore, but in Malaysia and Indonesia, both of which are interestingly, ostensibly Muslim countries. But of course, money has a certain kind of influence in these situations. So they were raising pigs, in this case in Malaysia. At the same time, the late 1990s, as a result of climate change, there was a much stronger El Nino effect than usual. There was a drought, and in Indonesia next door, people were clearing land by burning forests to clear land in order to, in many cases, to grow palm trees for palm oil. So here we have a good intention to try to displace fossil fuels with palm oil, and they're clearing forests and they're burning forests, which has its own immediate effects, but it also created a smoke haze as a result of this El Nino drought over the whole area. And you could see this from space, and I won't show you the picture, but the whole area was covered in a haze. Embedded in that, we have these fruit bats who normally migrate through the area, and they're looking for fruit trees, which they eat the fruit, but they also pollinate and spread the seeds. And the farmers in Malaysia, being green, if you want, the pigs were allowed to go outside. They planted mango trees around, which seems like a good thing from a sustainability point of view. From an immediate, if you wish, ecosystem health point of view, you would say, well, you're raising animals, but you have greenery around them. But the fruit bats, because they were disoriented from the smoke, they would find these mango trees, they would eat them. The mangoes, they're messy eaters, they would drop the feces into the pig pens. And it turns out that the bats were carrying something called, which we now call Nipah virus. At the time, people had no idea what this was. A lot of pigs died and a lot of people died before they figured out what this was, and they were able to contain it. But here we have a confluence, if you want, of influences of global things like climate change, immediate things, Singapore trying to be a clean and healthy city community, but offloading some of its impacts elsewhere, which a lot of countries in Europe and North America, we've done a lot of that, and agricultural production. So we have these kinds of narratives weaving together. And then we have this much longer narrative going back to 1600. Henry IV of France said, if God keeps me, I will make sure that no peasant in my realm will lack the means to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. Well, it turns out God did not keep him very well. He was assassinated a few years later by a fanatic Catholic who didn't think Henry was sincere in his conversion to Catholicism. He'd been a Huguenot a few years before. So we have that idea that what we would like to do politically, and you would say, well, this is a good thing. We want to make sure that the poorest people in the realm, the peasants, have enough means in order to eat properly. At about the same time, a little bit later, we have René Descartes, who developed his discourse on method, who said that we've had too much just book learning and passing on of ideas. We should go out and look at the world around us. And he developed these scientific principles, which have formed the basis of the way we have done science, the way we recognize science, at least until relatively recently. And what he said was, for by them I perceived it to be possible to render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature. And this idea, this mentality that we can use scientific principles to control natural phenomena is deeply, deeply embedded in the way we do science. And it's been very successful and in many ways. And if we look at, for instance, the chicken in every pot, if we look at the trends in the last, since 1960s, animal production, in particular eggs, chickens, sheep and goats, aquaculture, these have all dramatically increased. And of course, world population has also increased. And this is largely the result of having done good traditional science, if you want, looking at the specifics of vitamins and antibiotics. In the 1950s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, vitamins were identified so that they could identify vitamin D, which otherwise the chickens, for instance, would need to be outside to get the vitamin D activated. If you could identify it, synthesize it, put it in the feed, then the chickens can be brought inside and you can go to economies of scale. And If you go to economies of scale, it brings the price down. If there are some diseases, then we learned how to manufacture antibiotics using the same kind of science, which is very good at identifying things and very poor at looking at relationships, which is why we began looking at ecosystem approaches to health, because that's looking at relationships which you can't bring into the laboratory. And so it tends to be marginalized within the mainstream of science. How did we do this? It wasn't, there were these, we look at the basic science, but the basic science was embedded in larger social changes, technological changes, social changes. So before we went from small farms, at the top picture, we have the farmer and the butcher and the animal rights activist all in the same picture. In the lower picture, we have some, the pigs just kind of hanging out, relaxed. We have this more local idea of agriculture. Subsequent to that, and as a result of these technological advances, which go back to Descartes, but were really developed rapidly in the post-war period, we don't see people inside these farms. They're relatively rarely, they're basically computer run from the outside, again, another technology, and the economies of scale, where the idea was that in order for poor people to afford food, you go to much larger farms, so you bring down the price per chicken, per pig, per whatever animal you're looking at, and so then poor people can afford it. That's solving the problem in a particular way. Another way to solve it would be to say, let's incorporate the real costs, the ecological costs, the social costs inside the system, which will raise the cost of meat and vegetables and other things. And it's one of the arguments against, for instance, local organic and so on, is that it raises the price. Poor people can't afford this. One could turn that around and say, well, if they can't afford it, maybe we should have some sort of a guaranteed income, increase the minimum wage, a range of interventions so that it's not that people have a chicken in the pot every day or every weekday or every Sunday, but they have the means in order to live, to have a sufficient food. So we don't rely on the farmers to bring down the price. We change the way wealth is distributed so people can afford to pay the actual price. During the same time period, the 1990s primarily, and the early parts of the 21st century, everyone wanted more trade. We had trade delegations going to Russia, going around the world, going to China, and saying, can we trade? Can we have more interaction? And using this industrial model where we have specialized, so we grow mangoes in one place and we grow avocados in another place, and then other people do other things, and then we trade things around. Certainly from a food safety point of view, it created all kinds of problems. This is actually a mathematical representation of one of the international food trade networks. It's confusing, it's paralyzing. The idea was that everybody would make more money. It turned out that there was more money, but it wasn't everybody that made more money. It was not evenly distributed. And here we get to, again, to the crux of the social implications of the way we solved that food problem. And the result of this then was these unexpected outcomes, these complications, because of the complexity of the interactions within scales and across scales. And this is another painting by Robert Gonsalves, where we have essentially humanity over here playing with a train, and there's actually a real train coming out of the hallway over there. And I think we're in the midst of the train that's actually quite close to us right now. One of the unexpected consequences was avian influenza. And we could pick out various ones. I'm picking out this one because it's actually directly relevant to the coronavirus. And so we went to economies of scale, and the areas where we were doing agriculture began encroaching more on wildlife areas. There was more interaction between the wild birds and the domestic animals. And in January and February of this year, there were large outbreaks of avian influenza in Hunan province, which is south of Wuhan. So this put some constraints on the amount of chicken that was available in the market at that time. Another story here, if you want another narrative, is of African swine fever, which is not a zoonotic disease. It emerged in sub-Saharan Africa, as you can imagine from the name. When the Italians invaded Eritrea and Ethiopia, they brought with them some cattle which had a disease called cattle plague, which is a rinderpest virus, which is related to measles, and that's a whole other kind of story. But it killed 90% of the ungulates in sub-Saharan Africa, and 1/3 to 2/3 of people in the countryside died who were hurting these animals. They were starving to death. And the colonists brought in then swine from Britain, from the Seychelles and other places into this area because they wanted to raise their own food. Well, it turns out there was a natural cycle between wild boar and ticks in that area of this virus, African swine fever virus, which didn't cause many problems with the wildlife, but it killed domestic pigs in large numbers. And there were outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa and Europe, throughout Europe until I think the 1970s at least, and into Latin America and the Caribbean. And the disease has been controlled by stamping out. There's no vaccine. You basically kill the animals and isolate the farms. Well, in 2018, that disease arrived in China. And some people say it came from Russia, the Russians deny it, or from Europe, or from sub-Saharan Africa. The bottom line is that it got into China. Within 2 years, 2018, 2019, beginning of 2020, half the pigs in China, 200 million pigs, died from the disease or were killed to stamp out this disease. So we have, and that was 1/4 of all the pigs in the world. If everybody from everywhere had shipped all of their pigs to China, they wouldn't have been able to meet the market demand, in part because the end of January and into February was the Chinese New Year coming up, the end of the year of the pig and the celebration of the year of the rat. So we have this tens of millions of people coming together for a celebration. We often look at the wet market in Wuhan. Many people have looked at that as a place where the story began, but in fact, as I've already indicated, the story weaves in some other lines and other narratives there. We all want to have fresh food, and there's been a big move to have fresh food, to have local markets, and the people in China are no different. They want to have fresh food. A wet market is like a very big farmer's market, if you like, and we would think this is a good thing. If you don't have refrigeration, there are limited ways to preserve the food. If farmers kill the animals at home and bring them to the market, if they don't sell them and there's no refrigeration, they have lost, the meat goes to waste completely. The way you get around that is you either find ways of preserving, as they have here, or you bring in live animals. Now, related to this, there's kind of an underground semi-black market marketing of wildlife, which are brought into these areas and they're sold live again so that they're fresh. That tends not to be the main focus of these wet markets. It tends to be other foods. So we have a reduction in chicken, we have a massive reduction in pigs, and we have tens of millions of people coming up to the new year looking for food. And of course, the underground market in wildlife then becomes somewhat expanded because these people in the market are trying to market they're trying to make a living. The reason I put salmon there is because there was a subsequent outbreak in the largest fresh food market in Beijing. Supplies, I think, 90% of the fresh produce in Beijing of this coronavirus, which was a slightly different strain than was found in Wuhan. It was isolated from a cutting board where salmon had been cut up. The salmon, it turns out, came from Norway. And so the story was, well, maybe it came from Norway, but maybe it got on the cutting board another way. Maybe somebody brought it in, or maybe it was the distributor or the airplane. So we have these different narratives, if you want, these that are woven together depending on people's orientation and where they saw the benefit to themselves. So we have this new year coming up, 25th January to 11th of February. And I like this horoscope. It said, let's see how this rat year will work out for you. Well, it is working out in a very interesting way. I was actually born in a year of the rat. My mother-in-law was born in China, so she informed us, you know, the kinds of years we were born in. But then we had this emergence of this coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus, and COVID-19, which is the disease. So then if we come back to these ecosystem approaches, we need to ask, what's the system of which we're trying to keep healthy? Who owns it? Whose health are we promoting? And whose story is this? I've got three pictures here that relate to avian influenza. The top right is, I took it in a market in Southeast Thailand. And it was, this woman was marketing free-range chicken, village chickens that run around in the, around their households and in the village, and commercial chickens. And WHO and other international agencies were pushing them to shift to commercial chickens inside so that they wouldn't be exposed to the virus outside, wouldn't be interacting with waterfowl, with ducks and geese. But it turns out that in the market itself, this woman said she was getting, I think it was 10 times as much on a per kilogram basis for the birds, the free running birds, as she was for the commercial birds. So the economic pressure was exactly the other way. And so it comes down to, we had one narrative globally which said, we want to stop this disease. We have another narrative which says, I want to make a living, and this is the best way for me to make a living. In the lower left-hand corner is, I was running a workshop in Java, in Indonesia, again during this time period. And it was an area where there were said to be a lot of, there was a lot of avian influenza. This one village said, we don't have any. And we went and talked to them a little bit, and they said if there were sick chickens, we threw them out the back. So they had some sick chickens, but we couldn't see them. And then we went to see, well, let us see your poultry. Well, it turned out that they have competitive singing roosters, which are worth $2,000 to $3,000 US, which is much more than these people would make in a year. And if the government comes in and says, well, you've got avian influenza, and they depopulate, which was the way to deal with it, then, and said, well, we'll replace them with market value. Well, clearly the market value of a singing rooster, a competitive singing rooster, which has a long genetic pedigree, is very different than a commercially raised chicken. The other picture up here is a workshop I was involved in Argentina, where we were looking at EcoHealth of the Yungas, the eastern slopes of the Andes. And we were looking at the interaction between human health, environmental health, animal health. And we had physicians who were interested in clean water for people. We had veterinarians, we had wildlife biologists who were interested in counting species and maintaining biodiversity. And then we had some indigenous leaders. And one of the indigenous leaders said that the issue was not counting all the species, and it wasn't putting in flush toilets or something. It had to do with indigenous land rights in terms of maintaining whole ecosystems in which indigenous people could live. And the arguments became quite heated because we had such different views of the world and the way to solve them. And at one point, one of the indigenous leaders, she said that, well, if we had this discussion among other indigenous groups, at this point, we just kill the other people. And we were an academic group here, researchers, and we thought, well, maybe we can not kill each other at this point. We can keep this discussion going, which we did. But it also told me that we are dealing here not with some theoretical issue. When we talk about EcoHealth in real situations, these are people's livelihoods. These are very deeply held attachments to land, to livelihoods, and so on. The temptation is always to oversimplify. We always simplify in different ways, but to declare that there's only one story. This is the narrative that, the narrative of progress, or the economic progress, or its jobs, or it's maintaining the environment. I talk about it as the Babel temptation, the mythology of the Tower of Babel, where we built this great tower and everybody would speak the same language and we would solve global problems by all working together to solve the global problem. We can feed everybody in the world. We know how to do this. This is how we will do it. And that, in a sense, was the scientific view. If everybody adapts to essentially the 17th and 18th century European view of science and classifying things using European high-class Latin to classify animals instead of classifying them based on local ecological functions and so on. Whether they're good to eat or not. So they have a species, genus and species, they belong to families. And that certainly is an important way to classify them, but it's not the only way. It's one story. Another way to look at it is Douglas Adams did this facetiously in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We have a babblefish where there are many stories, but we try to find ways to understand the other ways of communicating, whether it's insects communicating with each other or with plants, or plants communicating with each other, or people across cultures, finding ways to do that. How do we move ahead in this situation? If I take a look at it as a veterinarian, if you want, for individuals, the diagnostic and clinical treatment decisions are made by a clinician together with a client, somebody who's sick or whose animal is sick or whose farm is having problems. So these are judgment calls based on lots of different kinds of information, laboratory, exams, we get a history, and we've got a pretty good idea about the quality of that information. For pandemics and epidemics and situations as we are in now, where everything is changing rapidly and it's changing globally, how do we diagnose the problem? Do we diagnose it differently? The response decisions involve multiple experts, different kinds of peers and owners, people in different communities. And so we have different temporal and spatial boundaries. The quality and reliability of the information from those multiple sources are much more difficult to assess because they're assessed differently by different people depending on the kinds of clinical judgments they would make in their situation. And those judgments may be conflicting. They may say, well, we want to draw boundaries around this and maintain these, or we want to push for having these kinds of interventions, if you want, which may be different from what other people would see. So our scientific and technological progress that I indicated before, particularly with regard to agriculture, but it's across medicine, it's across environmental sciences, it's in all of our fields, has relied on our ability to focus very clearly on what's in front of us. In order to move ahead, we need to be able to see everything that's around us, which requires a kind of peripheral vision. If you think of individuals, our own peripheral vision, if we lose that, we begin stumbling around because we can't orient very well to the spaces we're in. At a global level, when we have multiple ecosystems, if you want, multiple cultures, multiple communities with very different viewpoints, we need to be each other's peripheral vision, because I can't encompass everything. I'm good at what's in front of me, It doesn't mean I have to know everything, but I need to be able to communicate across boundaries, across cultures, across species, so that I can understand if I'm trying to accomplish this, if I do this in terms of food production or in terms of disease control, what are the implications economically or environmentally? If somebody is making environmental changes with regard to policy interventions, what are the implications, the possible implications for human health, for economics, and finding ways to accommodate those different visions and collaboration across disciplines. By and large, universities and government departments have not been very good at that. And hopefully, as we move ahead, we can build organizations that enable us to look at, if you want, health at a more global scale, but also more locally, to collaborate across these different areas. Now, I mentioned that I worked on Idata disease in Kathmandu, and I went there in the early 1990s. The situation looked like it was at the top there. So but I was there really just to look at this one parasite. Well, it turned out in order to address that one parasite, we had to look at gender issues, we had to look at animal slaughter, and we had to look at environmental sustainability. And we ended up working with these communities to create a situation like you see at the bottom, where they created community slaughterhouses, enclosed water areas. They planted plants along the riverbank to stop the erosion. We ended up having to change everything, if you want. So it may be that in order to get a handle on a pandemic like this, we may end up having to change everything. And this is where we get back to the good things about this pandemic. It's caused by an agent that comes from animals, so it can't be eradicated. So we have to rethink our relationship with nature. It's shattered the idea that we can completely control nature, and thus we need to rethink how we do sciences and how sciences relate to social studies, anthropology, political activities, post-normal science, that way of looking at things. And it's lasting long enough to allow us time to, in fact, do these things, to reorganize, to create a more sustainable, if you want, global convivial economy. The last time we had a disease come through like SARS, it happened so fast that the technology was able to take care of it. This time, that hasn't been successful, and there are a whole range of reasons for that, but we now have the time to think about how can we reorganize to develop a green economy, a more globally just economy. And I'll finish with two quotes here. The top one is from Pablo Neruda, the well-known Chilean poet. This I know at great cost, all life is not outward, nor is all death from within. The idea being that people don't just live to avoid getting sick and dying. We live for being with our friends, for enjoying life, for interacting with nature, all of these other things. So there's a kind of dynamic there. And the other is from an anthropologist, Emily Yates Dorr, who was looking at people in Wageningen who were studying the insects as a possibility of basically saving the planet. They were going to be the next big food. And I wrote a whole book on that, so it enabled me to go around and look at different places where this was happening. And it became clear that there was a technological vision. We can take these insects, we can grow them, we can create these foods, and then we can feed the world. But there's the other way, which is these insects were embedded in local ecologies and local cultures, quite different in different parts of the world. And in order to actually deal with this larger problem, we needed to attend to many different worlds, not just the one world that we see in front of us. And to me, that's been a major shift in terms of how I think about ecosystem approaches to health, that there is this local nestedness, are these porous boundaries, and the need then to have much more collaboration across multiple kinds of boundaries in order to achieve something that is possibly sustainable into the future. And I'll leave it at that and open it for questions, if we have time.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor David Waltner-Toews, for this very interesting, clear, and very inspiring presentation. Personally, I could have kept on listening to you for hours because it was really like intriguing and hearing all these stories. And so personally, I found it a really interesting topic. So thank you so much for willing to give us this presentation, and thank you for your time. I see that the time is almost up, but maybe we can ask, I don't know if it's possible to still keep on going for a little bit if you have time and who wants to keep on listening to you, if we can ask a few questions. Jan, maybe?
At the Q&A here, and I'm just, somebody mentioned the bushmeat, and it's not up to us to change that, but if the eating bushmeat is embedded in deforestation and mining, and the mining is there in order to bring things out of the ground to produce computer chips for us, then we have some obligation to change that context. It doesn't tell people what to eat, but it says maybe we can change the context so that they have better access to other sources of food and that we're not encroaching on wildlife. That's part of our responsibility then, because the mining is there not because they necessarily want the mining, but because we want the mining. So I think we look for that way to collaborate with other people. And
Yes.
Another question had to do with the success of the economic system. And I think the point is true. I mean, and I think that's what I was trying to say after that, successful for whom? We Europeans and North Americans and Australians and New Zealanders, we have seen it as being successful, and China in the early part of this century, because it has benefited certain people. And I think it's becoming clear now that it doesn't benefit everybody. I'm sorry, I should let somebody else screen the questions because I know we're out of time here.
No, definitely. No, I think it's very good. You've already screamed on yourself and you're already answering. So this is really, really excellent. Yeah. I also see that there is a question from Bruno into what you would suggest as the best way to label systemic approaches to health. What do you think of planetary health, for example? Is it yet another label? Is it semantics? What are your visions on this?
I was involved in some of the early battles where the semantics became, there was blood on the floor in academia, if you like, between ecosystem health and EcoHealth and conservation medicine and these kinds of things.
And One Health, yeah.
And One Health. And part of the battle is money tends to flow to the latest version of this. There are some differences in the sense that One Health has tended to be bureaucratic top-down, large organizations, because it's a simple, people like having slogans, right? One Health is easy, everybody can sort of get an idea without necessarily having to change a lot. But EcoHealth has tended to be ground up, research-based, community-based. And so I was more interested in that side. In going ahead, we need to have interactions at all levels, because clearly there are problems which have accumulated to the global level, climate change and things like planetary health. And many of the cumulative effects have been made at local level. So we need to have this kind of dynamic interaction between what people do at the local level and what the implications might be at higher level. And so you have these larger issues where there's a lot of communication, and you set some guidelines, and they can shift money around. That's very important. But then the real action takes place more regionally, not necessarily in a small community or in a backyard, but perhaps in a bioregion or a trading region where we have some influence over what's going on there. So there's a tension between all of these things, and I've come to see that as a good thing. As a veterinarian, you say that the difference between a roadkill and a live dog is in the roadkill, we have all the same chemicals as in the live dog, but in the live dog, there's a kind of dynamic tension which indicates life. There are things that are good and bad, and there's a tension. And I think the same is true as we go ahead. We want to have that kind of tension and debate without falling into what we see now as this polarization and people yelling at each other. Standing back, a bit of humility and saying, we have different perspectives on this. Who gains from different perspectives, and how can we negotiate our way through this?
Yeah, definitely, indeed. Yeah, it was also part of one of my questions, because we always have to battle as scientists with lack of resources. We all fight for the same pot of money. So how to deal with it? How can we actually work together, go with these systemic integrated approaches to health to tackle some of these wicked problems? It's definitely.
And I found it was very important as I was doing this, that I had a mentor, if you want, somebody on the inside, a senior administrator who believed in this and who could channel some money into what I was doing. He wasn't as activist as I myself and some others were, but he was able to access sources of political influence and money that I couldn't do that directly. So trying to find allies in different places, and there are these kinds of allies available now in different universities, different institutes. And it's a constant challenge for people coming through the system.
Indeed, and then from there, from science, let's say, then to put it into practice, we're then faced with other challenges also, because we are imposed with institutional, logistical barriers. So not only within the scientific world, but then when we want to put it in practice, we're then faced with other challenges. How do we deal with lack of resources, local, national, global level, indeed.
And I think the institutes like yours, or like the Swiss Tropical Institute with Jakob Zinstock and so on, there are possibilities there that are not focused on a discipline so much as on looking at regional problems where all of these things come together. And so I think there are opportunities to move ahead in this.
I think so too, yes. We're positive about it. I see there are other questions coming in. From Orson Marlon, that says, dear professor, you have pointed out very clearly the consequences of our carnivorous behaviors and other consumerisms. Do you think that degrowth is necessary, as it's not to declare the end of progress as impulsed by the ecothetrism?
Thatcherism.
Thatcherism.
Yeah, Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and that whole era of deregulating, which ended up in these spaghetti diagrams of international food trade and created many of the problems that we're in right now. Maybe degrowth is I don't know, people don't like that word because it sounds negative. And rather than saying that, let's look at maybe sustainable or more collaborative, or it will result in an economy that you don't want an economy that's constantly growing, because it's growing for whom, right? Have it more deeply rooted in different places, and certainly in North America, we'll have to give up some of the things we thought, we would want. Some people say, well, we should all shift to a vegetarian diet, but if we stick with the industrial model, then, for instance, we end up eating avocados, which is good for us personally. But avocados in California, where they're grown, they use more water than the cities of San Francisco and Los Angeles. It's not a sustainable system. In places like Mexico and other places, avocado growth some of it's been taken over by people who were marketing drugs before. So it's become a kind of a violent war. Part of that is the notion that we can have a globalized industrial system. And so we need to pull back from that, look at more regional. Doesn't mean we quit trading, but we're more careful, we monitor. We have colleagues and friends in other parts of the world who can tell us, well, this is the consequences of your actions here. If you want food safety in Europe, it's not a matter of just protecting the consumers in Europe. It's looking at who's growing that food, what kind of livelihoods do they have, how much independence do they have in making choices. The solution isn't going to be using a computer tracing of food from farm to fork, because then somebody will want control to control that whole process. And of course, it's Nestle's and Cargill and various other people who want to control that process. It's more looking at how can we find ways to accommodate local cultural needs in different parts of the world and negotiate across that. And some people will have to give up some things and some people will gain some things. So I think it's more complicated than simply saying it's degrowth. that's one way to frame it, and it can be useful in certain contexts to make the argument that way.
Another question is power in global health sufficiently open to this systemic approach to health? Are they evolving in the right direction?
Well, maybe you can tell me. I'm sort of at the other, I'm looking at how it's evolving. I mean, we all live in sort of bubbles that we listen to people who think like we do, and we get upset hearing people that radically disagree with us. I think that it probably, we're being actually forced in that direction of being more collaborative and sometimes for maybe the wrong reasons. I mean, the battles with China or with Russia or with other countries where they, we're not going to trade anymore, we're not going to do this. It may have a beneficial effect, at least if we take advantage of it. It can have a beneficial effect in the sense that we can continue to trade, but reevaluate how we do that. How, who's benefiting from this? Whose story is being told here? Who's trying to control it? I'm reminded of the situation, if you think about the Resilience Alliance, this figure 8, where systems go through building up and then they go through a crash and renewal. We're certainly going through a crash right now. And the question is, who it will pick up the pieces and begin to reorganize. If we look at what happened after the Berlin Wall came down, that was a huge lost opportunity. And we have an opportunity now to take this crashed system and rebuild it in a more sustainable way. So I'm more hopeful that way. Maybe we should end on that. I mean, the questions can go on for a long time, but.
Indeed, I agree. It was really extremely interesting. Thank you so much again. And I hope that also the other participants, I see 27, that's a really good number, also enjoyed. I remember that, I remind you that the presentation is recorded. So I think if we want to enjoy your talk one more time, we can all re-listen to it and also share it with people that could not attend today because of other commitments and reasons. I think there is one more slide that they will share with us. Thank you so much, Professor.
So yes, thank you, David Waltner-Toews, for your very interesting seminar, and the audience for your attention and the interesting discussion as well. So the next EcoHealth seminar is going to be on November the 3rd by Professor Maria Nilsson from the University of Umeå, and the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. She will talk about climate change and the health impacts and vulnerabilities, including mental health aspects. She will also talk about the work of the Lancet Countdown in general and adaptation, planning, and resilience for health in particular. So thank you very much for joining this session, and we hope to see you next month for the next seminar. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.